A convoy rolled down a gravel road, engines droning, dust trailing like smoke behind retreating columns. Inside, the truck sat tired men in uniforms bleached by desert sun, eyes hollow, silence thick. They expected barbed wire, shouted orders, maybe punishment. What they found instead was a compound of wooden barracks, neat rows under the American flag. At the entrance, nailed to a post, one word in white paint: infirmary. The smell of antiseptic hit first. Inside, cots stretched in lines, sheets pulled taut, lamps burned low. American nurses moved swiftly, the clatter of enamel basins echoing in the heat. And among the prisoners chosen from the column were men pulled aside, handed stiff white coats. "Doctor," the interpreter said in clipped tones, "you will work here." Karl Hoffmann froze. Only weeks earlier, he had been a German army physician in North Africa, a captain patched into Rommel's war. Now, stripped of rank, stripped of freedom, he was given back the tools he thought he had lost. He looked at the patients, German soldiers burned raw from desert sores, Americans with fractured arms and bandaged heads, and on the far cot, a young guard with fevered skin, breath rattling. For a long second he hesitated, coat heavy in his hands. Then training returned like muscle memory. He pressed a stethoscope against the guard's chest. The sound of lungs wheezing filled his ears, universal, indifferent to sides. That night, by the flicker of a lantern, Hoffmann scribbled in a small notebook he had carried since Heidelberg. "Prison takes away the uniform. It leaves only the body, broken and waiting. Today, I touched life again, and for a moment the war was outside. The camp had brought them here to contain enemies. Instead, it had handed enemies the duty of saving life. And from that day forward, the hospital became the one place inside the wire where the war's front line blurred. The ward grew crowded within weeks. Work crews returned from the fields limping, coughing, bleeding from accidents with saws and hammers. The cots filled with groans, and the air thickened with sweat, iodine, and fear. Guards leaned in door frames with rifles resting against their shoulders, eyes locked on every hand that touched a scalpel. One afternoon, they brought in a prisoner whose leg had rotted black with gangrene. The stench spread across the room, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Hoffmann asked, in broken English, for a knife. Silence followed. The guard standing closest gripped his pistol, weighing risk against necessity. Finally, he nodded. The blade passed across, metal against metal. Minutes later, the room shook with the rasp of saw on bone. The man under chloroform moaned, body jerking, as the leg came away. The bleeding slowed, the stump was bound. He would live, but never walk the same. The tension deepened after each operation. Guards whispered that one slip of the hand could kill. Prisoners in the barracks muttered that doctors who served Americans were no longer comrades. Every step back to the ward was a walk through suspicion. In his notebook, Hoffmann wrote, "If I lose a life, they will say I betrayed. If I save one, they will say I surrendered. There is no path except to continue." Not all patients wore stripes. A young American sergeant was carried in, fever blazing, lips cracked. The camp medic hesitated with the dosage, hands trembling. Hoffmann stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Too strong. He not wake. He adjusted the vial, ordered blankets. For days he returned, pressing cloths to the soldier's head, listening to breath rattle in the chest. On the fourth night, the fever broke. The sergeant's eyes opened, confused, and landed on the man who had saved him. His whisper was hoarse. "Why help me?" Hoffmann answered without lifting his gaze. "Because you breathe." The hospital became a place of contradictions. Outside, towers and fences defined enemies. Inside, pain erased them for hours at a time. But the rifles at the foot of each bed never let anyone forget. This mercy was granted under suspicion, every heartbeat measured by eyes waiting for betrayal. The ward was never quiet at night. Men woke screaming in languages the guards could not understand, fists pounding the bed frames, eyes wide with ghosts of deserts and oceans. Some shouted names of comrades already buried. Others curled in silence, trembling until dawn. The guards at first thought it was staged, a trick. Then they saw the sweat-soaked sheets and the faces twisted in terror. These were wounds without bullets. Orderlies sat beside them, gripping shoulders until the shaking slowed. One Italian hummed a lullaby from his village, his voice thin, almost childlike, just enough to cut through the panic. A German whispered to a prisoner thrashing in his bunk, "Africa is gone. You are here now." The words meant little, but the rhythm calmed him. American soldiers carried their own invisible scars. A corporal burned in a training accident stared at the ceiling for days, repeating, I should have been with them. Hoffman sat by his bed, answering with the same phrase every night. You remain. That is your duty now. Years later, the corporal admitted, the first words that reached me came from a man I thought I hated. Sickness pressed harder than memories. Tuberculosis hollowed lungs, left men coughing blood into rags. Dysentery swept through barracks, filling buckets faster than they could be emptied, the smell thick as rot. Prisoner doctors burned straw mattresses in smoking heaps, boiled blankets until fibers frayed. Their hands cracked from lye, their throats raw from smoke. Still the coughing filled the night. One prisoner with advanced tuberculosis whispered before dying, I want to hear birds once more. His orderly opened the window, though frost cut the air. The man smiled faintly at the cold and was gone minutes later. Even the guards bowed their heads when the body passed. There were moments of bitter irony. An American guard and a German prisoner lay in beds only feet apart, both coughing into stained cloths. For days, they ignored each other. Then one night, the guard muttered, You sound worse than me. The German chuckled between coughs. We could trade lungs. Weak laughter broke the silence, carrying farther than either breath would last. The hospital was a place of endings as much as healing. Some men walked out thin but alive. Others left on stretchers wrapped in sheets. Hoffman noted in his journal, Infection has no loyalty. It chooses without flag, and we fight it together, though none of us admit it aloud. The ward was never silent after lights out. Darkness pressed against the thin wooden walls, and then it began. Sudden shouts and guttural bursts, cries of halt, or names screamed into nothing. Beds rattled as prisoners jolted upright, eyes open but blind to the present. Guards burst through doors more than once with pistols drawn, thinking it a fight, only to find men clawing at shadows. An Italian orderly described it later. They were not awake and not asleep. Their mouths spoke Africa, but their eyes saw nothing. We could only hold them until it passed. The Americans called it shell shock. The prisoners used no name at all. One night, a German corporal thrashed so violently he split the boards of his bunk. His knuckles bled as he struck the wall again and again, crying for Hans, a brother dead in the desert. Hoffman crouched beside him, pressed cloths to the hands, and whispered in German, Hans is gone, but you are here. The words broke something. The corporal collapsed, sobbing, breath ragged until exhaustion dragged him under. Guards watched from the doorway, rifles slack, unsure whether to step closer or step back. The Americans brought their ghosts too. A corporal burned during training arrived with his arms swathed in gauze, skin raw. His wounds healed, but his voice did not. He stared upward, repeating, I should have been with them. Why me? Why not me? For days, he refused food. On the third night, Hoffman sat in the dark beside his bed. You live, he said quietly. That is your duty now, not theirs. The words returned every night until the soldier finally ate. Later, he wrote home, Strangest thing, it was a German who told me I had to keep living. Sickness stalked the barracks more relentlessly than memory. Tuberculosis spread with winter cold. Men coughed until their chests rattled, spitting blood into rags. Dysentery swept through rows of bunks, buckets overflowing, the stench sour and choking. Guards gagged while carrying them out. The hospital turned into a furnace of labor. Prisoner doctors burned straw mattresses in smoking piles. They boiled linens in vats until the fabric shredded in their hands. Their palms cracked from lye. Their clothes stank of smoke, but still the coughing filled the nights. One prisoner whispered, moments from death, I want to hear birds once more. His orderly dragged his cot to the window despite the frost. The man listened, eyes half closed, until a sparrow's thin chirp carried through. He smiled faintly. Minutes later, he was gone. The guard who witnessed it muttered after, I never thought death could be so quiet. Irony haunted the ward. An American guard and a German prisoner lay in beds feet apart, both fighting pneumonia. For days, neither spoke, coughing into the same silence. Then one night the guard rasped, You sound worse than me. The German chuckled weakly. We should trade lungs. Both laughed, short and harsh, but it was laughter all the same. The sound carried down the row, startling even the nurses. For that moment, there was no enemy, only two men gasping through the same sickness. Suspicion never left entirely. Some prisoners feigned illness to dodge fieldwork. Guards demanded examinations, x-rays when possible, suspicious that their own doctors might shield comrades. Hoffman wrote, Every diagnosis is judged as loyalty or betrayal, yet the fever on a man's forehead cannot be faked. The lungs do not lie. Even children's voices reached the ward. One evening, A farmer's boy from the nearby town stumbled through the gate, pale, fever burning, escorted by his desperate father. Regulations said no civilian should enter. The commandant hesitated, then gave the order. The boy was laid on a cot, chest heaving. American medics shook their heads. It was Hoffman who placed his hand on the small ribcage, listening. "Pneumonia," he muttered, and began. Nurses swabbed, Rizzi mixed injections, guards stood frozen. By dawn, the fever broke. The father wept, gripping the hands of the very men his government had told him to hate. The hospital blurred lines that the war had carved deep. In the towers, guards still spat kraut. In the barracks, prisoners still muttered Verräter. But within those plank walls, men lived or died by the same hands. Lanterns hissed, iodine burned the air, and sometimes laughter or song rose soft enough to drown suspicion for an hour. Hoffman recorded in his notebook, "Infection has no flag, memory has no uniform. Here we fight only against time." The ward had seen prisoners carried in from the fields, groaning, limping, covered in dirt. But one afternoon it was not a prisoner on the stretcher. 2 guards stumbled through the doors, faces pale, carrying one of their own. Blood soaked his shirt, spreading dark through the khaki. A splintered plank from the motor pool had torn into his chest, and each breath came shorter, wetter. The room froze, rifles lifted automatically, as if the danger were not the wound but the men in white coats. Then instinct overtook hesitation. Hoffman pulled scissors, cut through the shirt, and Rizzi pressed cloth hard against the bleeding. "Clamp," Hoffman barked in German, then in halting English. "Hold, here." The nurses obeyed. The guard moaned, eyes rolling. Ether was ration thin. They could not risk deep anesthesia. An orderly gripped his wrists, another pinned his legs. Rizzi's hands moved between broken ribs, slick with blood. Metal scraped bone. He found the vessel and pinched. "Suture," he demanded. The needle slid, thread pulled, knot tied tight. The bleeding slowed. The guard gasped once, then again, steadier. His chest lifted ragged, but it lifted. For minutes, no one spoke. The smell of iron and ether clung in the air. Finally, the American nurse whispered, "He's alive." The rifles lowered. The guard lay pale, sweat cooling on his brow. He whispered hoarsely, "Thought I was done." Hoffman replied quietly, "Not today." By nightfall, the story spread through towers and mess halls. Some scoffed that the doctors had only saved him to curry favor. Others repeated the details with awe, the German hand inside a bleeding chest, the Italian voice steady as stone. For the first time, guards and prisoners shared the same rumor, that an enemy had saved a guard's life. A week later, the commandant called the camp to assembly. Prisoners stood in rows under the sun, guards opposite, rifles gleaming. He read from a folded paper, voice clipped. "This camp acknowledges medical service rendered in accordance with the highest traditions of the profession." The words were careful, almost cold, but everyone heard the meaning, recognition. When he finished, silence stretched. Then a nurse began to clap. Another joined. Even some guards did. Prisoners looked at each other, uncertain, then raised their hands too. Applause rolled across the parade ground, strange and awkward, yet undeniable. Not all welcomed it. In the barracks that night, a sergeant spat at Hoffman's boots. "Collaborator," he hissed. Others muttered that saving Americans was betrayal. Hoffman wrote in his journal, "If I let him die, I betray medicine. If I save him, I betray my countrymen. Between these walls, there is only the patient and the wound." But for many, the image lingered. Guards who once spat kraut now nodded when they passed the infirmary. Nurses spoke of steady hands rather than enemy faces. Even prisoners whispered with pride, though they rarely admitted it aloud. The hospital became more than a ward that day. It became proof, however fragile, that a man could cross the line drawn in war, not with speeches, but with blood on his hands that was not his own. And though rifles still glinted at every door, something had shifted. For the first time, enemy and guard both knew. Inside those walls, skill could outweigh hate. Beyond the wire, farms stretched to the horizon. Fields of wheat swayed, towns bustled with fairs and church bells. Yet even there, word spread of the strange hospital inside the camp. Locals whispered of enemy doctors in white coats, men who had fought against American boys overseas now tending wounds under the stars and stripes. Some called it scandal, others called it providence. One evening, a farmer's truck rattled to the gate. In his arms lay a boy of 7, skin gray, breath rasping. The child had fallen onto a plow blade, chest torn open. Regulations barred civilians from entering. But desperation broke rules. The commandant hesitated, then waved them through. Guards marched close, rifles ready, as if the boy himself were contraband. He was laid on a cot in the ward. Hoffman leaned over, hand on the tiny ribcage, listening to shallow breath. Rizzi unrolled instruments with care. The father stood frozen, hat clutched to his chest, watching enemy hands move around his son. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the hiss of lanterns and the clatter of steel. Blood-stained gauze, thread pulled tight, lungs stitched and packed. Finally, the child exhaled in a long, steady sigh. His chest rose, then fell, then rose again. Alive. The father wept openly, gripping Hoffman's hands, gripping Rizzi's. Guards watched, some blinking quickly, some looking away. The man left with his son wrapped in blankets. Before he crossed the gate, he turned back once, nodded, and said simply, "Thank you." The story reached the town faster than the dust settled. Some scoffed that it was American skill that saved the boy, not the enemy. Others told it straight. German doctors had pulled him from death. Mothers carried the tale to markets. Pastors spoke it from pulpits. The name of the camp shifted from a place of fences to a place where life could be given back. Not everyone approved. A local paper printed a bitter letter. "Have we forgotten what these men are? They wear coats today, but last year they wore steel helmets. Are we so quick to forgive?" But another column ran beside it. "If even enemies can save life here, then what is it we are fighting to preserve, if not that?" Inside the camp, the atmosphere sharpened. Prisoners argued in whispers. Some spat that saving American children was treason. Others said nothing, but their eyes betrayed something different. Pride, buried but real. Guards grew quieter too. The rifles were still carried, the tower still manned. But the way men looked at the infirmary changed. One nurse, Margaret Hayes, wrote home. "They patched up a boy from the town today. I held the lantern as they worked. When he breathed again, I saw his father kiss the hand of a German. I will never forget that sight." From then on, townsfolk began leaving small offerings by the gate. A jar of preserves, a sack of apples, a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. They were never addressed, never spoken of, but the guards passed them inside. The hospital staff shared them with the patients, American and German alike. A strange communion formed, silent but enduring. For the prisoners, it was another paradox. Beyond the wire, they were still enemies. Inside the ward, they were healers. And now, even outside, strangers they had never met began to speak of them not as foes, but as doctors. The hospital became a machine that never stopped. Dawn brought stretchers from the fields. Noon brought fevers from the barracks. Night brought coughing that shook the walls. The lamps never went dark. Prisoner doctors learned to sleep in fragments. 20 minutes on a bench, 10 minutes with their head against a wall. Their eyes reddened, their hands trembled, but still they cut, stitched, and dressed wounds. Rizzi once worked 36 hours without pause. He stitched a torn artery, drained an abscess, then set a broken arm before finally collapsing into a chair. When a nurse tried to wake him for another case, he muttered in Italian, "Just one dream," and fell deeper into sleep. Minutes later, he was back at the table, eyes hollow, voice steady. The shortages carved deeper lines into their faces. Bandages were boiled until they shredded. Ether thinned, so patients were sometimes only half unconscious, groaning under the knife. Scalpel blades dulled until they tore more than cut. Hoffman rubbed his thumb across one edge and muttered, "It is like cutting with stone." Still, he used it. The alternative was to let men die. Guards noticed the exhaustion, but rarely spoke of it. Some looked away when a doctor's knees buckled mid-operation, when sweat dripped from his chin onto the wound. Others, grudging, muttered words they would not have said months before. "Give him water." Respect arrived disguised as practicality. One night the fever ward erupted. 20 men shook and moaned, blankets soaked through. Nurses shouted for help. Prisoner orderlies rushed in, carrying pails of water, pressing rags to heads, wiping sweat, whispering encouragement. A guard watching from the doorway admitted later, "I saw them, and it was like watching men bail a sinking ship. They didn't stop, not even when their own collapsed." Not every patient survived. Some died mid-operation, ether failing, lungs collapsing under hands that could not save. The bodies were carried out in silence, wrapped in sheets. After each, Hoffman sat at his desk, staring at his fingers. He wrote only short lines now, no longer full sentences. Too many. Not enough tools. Sleep is gone. The exhaustion broke barriers more effectively than speeches. Guards and prisoners began to share silence rather than suspicion. At night, When all cots were filled, some guards would leave food by the hospital door, an extra loaf, a thermos of coffee, no words spoken. Prisoners would bow their heads slightly in thanks, also without words. Fatigue had done what trust alone never could. One evening, a nurse walked past the ward and saw Hoffman asleep at the foot of a bed, head resting on folded arms, stethoscope still around his neck. The patient was breathing evenly. She later wrote, "He looked more like a shadow than a man, but he had kept that boy alive, and that was all that mattered." The hospital had become a crucible, burning everyone inside down to their barest selves. Outside the wire, the war still raged, names and battles filling newspapers. Inside, days blurred into nights, and life was measured not in victories, but in the number of pulses still felt under exhausted fingers. And so the men who had once fought across deserts now fought against sleep, against silence, against the endless tide of broken bodies. They did not win every battle, but they kept going. Respect did not arrive suddenly. It seeped into the camp like water through cracks, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. Guards who had once spat the word "kraut" under their breath began to watch the prisoners differently. They saw them carrying stretchers until shoulders bled raw. They saw them bending over wounds for hours, faces hollow with exhaustion, and never stopping. Suspicion gave way to something harder to name. Private Miller wrote in a letter home, "I hated them. I still do, in some ways. But I watched that German doc stay on his feet 40 hours straight, and I can't deny what I see. He ain't fighting me in that room. He's fighting death." Moments revealed the shift more clearly than speeches. A guard once walked into the ward with a cut hand, torn open on barbed wire. He balked when told to sit. "No German touches me." Minutes later, blood dripping onto the floor, he relented. Hoffman stitched the wound silently. When it was done, the guard flexed his fingers, then mumbled, almost inaudible, "Danke." The word startled him more than the wound. Even in the barracks, the hostility softened in small ways. Prisoners who had cursed the doctors now asked them for advice about aches and coughs. A sergeant who once called Hoffman a traitor now slipped him a note. "My bunkmate coughs blood at night. Can you look?" Pride forbade him from asking aloud, but need overcame pride. The nurses were the first to cross the invisible line. They shared cigarettes during long nights, traded stories, even taught a few English words. One nurse taught an Italian orderly to say, "Hold on," so he could whisper it to patients during operations. He repeated it again and again, his accent heavy, his eyes steady. Patients remembered that more than the pain. Not all bonds were soft. Some grew from fire. During a night storm, lightning struck the power line, plunging the camp into darkness. Generators failed, lanterns sputtered. In the ward, a man lay open on the table, chest cavity exposed, breath shallow. For a moment, panic seized everyone. Then guards and prisoners alike rushed to hold lanterns over the wound, shoulders touching, shadows falling across the same body. They worked in silence, light trembling in their hands, until the last stitch was tied. When power returned, no one spoke. They had all seen what mattered. Recognition came in small tokens. A guard once left a steaming mug of coffee on Hoffman's desk. No words, just warmth rising in the cold air. Another time, a prisoner found an apple on his pillow, slipped in by someone unseen. Such gestures could not be admitted, but they carried weight heavier than metals. Still, mistrust never vanished completely. The towers remained manned, rifles ready. Insults still surfaced in tense moments, yet the cracks widened. One American officer admitted later, "They stopped being just prisoners to me. I wouldn't call them friends, but I'd call them doctors." Inside the ward, the line blurred further each day. Guards leaned against doorframes, no longer with rifles at the ready, but with quiet questions. How long will he make it? Will the fever break? They were no longer speaking to enemies. They were speaking to colleagues, however unwillingly. By spring, the hospital had become something no one had planned. A place where respect was earned not with victories, but with sleepless nights, shaking hands, and breath drawn back from the edge. It was not peace, it was not forgiveness, but it was recognition. And for men who had been taught to see only uniforms, that recognition was the rarest medicine of all. By spring of 1945, the camp breathed a different air. Not just smoke, iodine, and sweat, but rumors. News filtered through newspapers left on mess tables, through letters half-censored, through the whispered talk of guards. Berlin bombed, bridges fallen, armies broken. Each headline felt like a drumbeat, carrying across the ocean straight into the ward. The prisoners read between the lines. A guard left a paper on a chair. A nurse muttered news under her breath while folding linen. The men in white coats caught fragments. Russians, Elba, collapse. They exchanged glances but said nothing aloud. At night, the hospital felt heavier. Patients asked questions the doctors could not answer. Will we go home? Will they keep us? Hoffman bent over a fevered man, adjusting a blanket, and the question came again. Is it over? He had no reply. Later, in his notebook, he wrote, Victory and defeat mean nothing on these beds. Here, the war ends only when the pulse stops. Still, hope seeped in. Some orderlies hummed quietly at work, old songs of villages left behind. Guards seemed less sharp, their rifles carried lower, their voices less harsh. Exhaustion was part of it, but something else too. The sense that perhaps they were all standing on the edge of a chapter about to close. Then came the wounded from work details, the sick with lungs full of fluid, the men wasting from infection. Even as rumors of surrender grew louder, the ward stayed full. The war might be ending outside, but inside, battles still raged hour by hour. One prisoner whispered, delirious with fever, If the war ends, will this stop too? His orderly pressed a rag to his forehead and answered, Not until you breathe easier. The patient smiled weakly before sleep claimed him. That small exchange carried further than gunfire. Exhaustion thickened. Rizzi slept sitting upright, scalpel still in his pocket. Nurses worked with shoulders drooping, hair stuck to their foreheads with sweat. Even guards sometimes leaned against walls with eyes closed, jerking awake when a groan rose from a cot. Yet moments of humanity pierced through. A guard who once cursed the prisoners now shared his cigarettes with them, passing one silently across a table. A prisoner offered half his ration of bread to an American fever patient, laying it by the cot without words. They all knew the front was collapsing far away, but here the walls held only breath and silence. The news finally broke one April morning. A guard walked in, paper folded under his arm, and whispered to a nurse, He's dead. Hitler's dead. The words flew like sparks. Prisoners looked at each other in stunned quiet. Some laughed bitterly. Others wept openly, not for the man, but for the war that had consumed everything. That night, Hoffman wrote only a single line in his journal. If the war dies, may it die here first. The hospital went on, unchanged. Beds still filled, fever still raged, blood still spilled onto floors scrubbed raw by tired hands. But something deeper shifted. For the first time since capture, the doctors looked at the future not as an endless line of cots, but as something beyond the fence. In those final weeks, the camp was a paradox sharper than ever. Outside, the world was collapsing in fire. Inside, men in white coats bent over wounds, whispering words of comfort in broken tongues. Enemies still, but bound now by exhaustion, by routine, by the knowledge that soon the war would release its grip. And when it did, no one knew whether they would walk free or stay behind. But all of them knew this. They had kept men alive until the very end. August brought heat heavy as lead, pressing the camp into stillness. Dust clung to sweat, and even the guards grew sluggish in their towers. Then, one morning, the sound of a radio drifted from the commandant's office, louder than usual. Men paused in their work. The interpreter hurried across the yard, face unreadable. A single phrase spread like fire. The war is over. At first, disbelief. Prisoners stared at each other, waiting for a trick. Some laughed harshly. Others sat down suddenly, as though their knees had given way. A few wept without shame. For years they had measured time by roll calls, by cots filled and emptied, by fevers broken and lives lost. Now the measure vanished. In the hospital, the words arrived more softly. A nurse whispered them while changing a dressing. Japan surrendered. The man on the cot blinked, lips cracked, and asked, Then, can I go home? No one answered. Across the room, Hoffman kept working, needle sliding, thread pulling, as if nothing had changed. Later, he wrote in his notebook, Peace is a word outside these walls. Here, only the sick decide when the war ends. Still, the atmosphere shifted. Guards lowered their rifles unconsciously, carrying them more like burdens than weapons. Nurses laughed more freely. Prisoners in white coats found themselves spoken to not as captives, but as colleagues. One American medic shook Rizzi's hand after a long surgery, the gesture awkward, but genuine. Rizzi muttered only, Grazie, eyes wet. Not every reaction was joy. Some prisoners feared what waited. Will they send us back to rubble? One asked. Will our families even be alive? Another muttered, better the ward than ruins. The hospital, for all its hardship, had become a strange refuge, clean sheets, regular food, and a duty that gave shape to empty days. One evening, the commandant himself walked through the ward without his cap. He stopped by a bed where a prisoner coughed blood into a rag. "He should be in a real hospital," he said quietly. Hoffman looked up and answered, "This is the only one we have." For a moment they stared at each other, not as enemy and commander, but as two men who had watched too many lives slip away. Then the commandant nodded and left. News from Europe and the Pacific filtered in slowly. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, cities gone in a flash. Prisoners whispered in horror, Americans in disbelief. For once, both sides shared the same stunned silence. A German orderly wrote later, "We had seen death in pieces, one man at a time. They saw it in a city. None of us could grasp it." The hospital did not stop. Men still limped in with injuries from farm work, still lay sweating with fevers, still needed stitches and bandages. But now, every task carried a different weight. Each cut sewn, each fever soothed, might be the last done as prisoners. The ward felt suspended, hanging between war and peace, between captivity and freedom. At night, lanterns hissed as they always had. But the conversations changed. Guards leaned in doorframes, speaking of going home, of farms and wives and children waiting. Prisoner doctors listened in silence, then quietly shared their own memories. A vineyard in Italy, a lecture hall in Heidelberg, a mother's garden in Bavaria. For a brief moment, the fence outside seemed thinner. One guard wrote afterward, "When the end came, I expected to feel triumph. What I felt instead was tiredness, and a strange respect for the men we had caged. They were supposed to be enemies. In the ward, they were something else." So the hospital continued in peace as it had in war. Beds filled, hands worked, men breathed or failed to. Only now the air carried a different sound, the distant echo of a world that, for the first time in years, was not tearing itself apart. The war was over, but the hospital did not vanish overnight. For months, the cots still filled, men still groaned with fevers, still arrived with crushed hands from work details, still needed stitches and compresses. The enemy was gone in headlines, yet here, in wood and iron and iodine, the fight against pain continued as if peace had never been declared. Slowly, transports came, names were called, prisoners marched out in columns to the trains that would carry them east. Faces lit with anticipation, others clouded with dread. Some feared going home more than staying. "What waits for us there?" one German muttered. "Ruins, graves," an Italian doctor whispered to a nurse. "Better to leave as a healer than return as a stranger." Hoffman was among those called. On the morning of his departure, he stood once more in the ward. Beds lined the barracks, lanterns hissed, the smell of iodine clung to the air. He placed his stethoscope on the desk, the same one handed to him when he arrived years earlier. His hands lingered on the cold steel. Then he turned to the nurses. "Keep saving them," he said quietly, his accent heavy. A guard escorted him to the gate. Miller, the one from Iowa, watched from the tower. Later he wrote, "I never thought I'd feel lost seeing a German walk away. But I did. I saw a doctor leaving, not an enemy." The prisoners dispersed back across the ocean to a continent broken and hollow. Some returned to villages without roofs, to families changed forever. Some never returned at all, lost to the disarray of post-war Europe. Yet the memory of their work in the camps lingered in unlikely places. American soldiers remembered waking to foreign hands setting their bones. Nurses remembered Italian voices whispering "no pain." Guards remembered moments when rifles lowered, if only for a heartbeat. Years later, veterans told the stories in fragments. One said, "I owe my life to a man whose language I couldn't understand." Another, "I hated him, but when fever burned me, his hand was cool." The paradox endured. For the prisoners, those years in the camp hospital became chapters they rarely spoke of. Some returned to medicine in their homelands, opening clinics among ruins. Others laid down the stethoscope, unable to carry the weight of what they had seen. Hoffman, according to one account, lectured in Heidelberg again, telling his students only once, "Even behind wire, even under guard, medicine must not bow to war." The camp itself was dismantled, fences pulled down, towers left to rust, barracks sold as scrap. Yet for those who had passed through the infirmary, its image never left. Rows of cots, hiss of lamps, the quiet rhythm of breath in the dark. In the end, the hospital stood as a contradiction the war could not erase. Enemies stitched enemies. Guards trusted the hands of captives. Life was preserved in a place built for confinement. And though the world outside measured the war in battles and bombs, Those who had seen the inside of that ward remembered it differently. They remembered the nights when uniforms disappeared, when only pulse and breath mattered. They remembered the silence after a life